London, August 1939. The air hung still over the Thames, heavy with a late summer haze. Children chased each other along the streets of Stepney, their laughter echoing between rows of narrow brick houses. Somewhere down the road, a radio crackled through the open window of a grocer's shop. "We urge all citizens to prepare." Few listened. Across Britain, thousands of corrugated steel sheets lay stacked in backyards, awaiting assembly. They were called Anderson shelters, named after Sir John Anderson, the Home Secretary who'd ordered their creation. Each was a simple arch of metal, half buried in the garden, meant to hold 6 people. Officials promised they'd protect families from falling bombs. To most Londoners, the idea seemed absurd. Bombs? On London? You can almost hear the scoffs. They said that during the last war too, and nothing happened here. Men joked that they'd rather die in bed than crawl into a hole in the ground. Children turned the shelters into play forts. Some families used them to store tools or bicycles, and many simply left the kits unassembled, stacked neatly behind hedges, forgotten in the sun. At the same time, across the Channel, the German Luftwaffe was expanding. Squadrons of Heinkel He 111 seconds, Dorniers, and Stukas filled newly captured French airfields. Crews trained for precision night bombing, studying maps of London, Coventry, and Liverpool. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler gave a quiet order to Hermann Göring prepare the Luftwaffe to crush British morale. The bombing of cities would not be merely military, it would be psychological. Yet in the pubs of London, the conversations remained stubbornly hopeful. "We'll talk our way out of it," some said. "The Germans won't dare cross the Channel," others added, waving pints in defiance. That September, when war was declared, there were tears in Westminster and silence in the streets. But the air raid sirens that followed those first whaling tests still felt theatrical, almost silly. Housewives smiled nervously and returned to their shopping. The shelters, now damp and rusting in the gardens, remained untouched. Only the old veterans, those who remembered the gas clouds of Ypres and the distant thunder of guns, felt a chill in the air. They knew that technology had changed. They knew that this time, war would come to the doorstep. As summer faded into autumn, the lights of London dimmed. Blackout curtains spread across the city, turning its brilliance into shadow. Children were evacuated to the countryside, thousands of them clutching gas masks and small brown suitcases. Trains carried them away from the capital in long, mournful lines. Mothers waved goodbye through tears, whispering promises they weren't sure they could keep. Then came the strange silence, months of it. The phony war, they called it. No bombs, no raids, no invasion. Londoners began to relax. The shelters turned into makeshift garden sheds again. And then, almost a year later, on a warm September evening in 1940, the sky changed. It began as a faint, rhythmic hum, distant, mechanical, almost musical. Then came the deeper roar, the vibration through the cobblestones, the flickering reflection of light on window glass. A young constable standing near the Tower of London looked up. His heart froze. There were hundreds of them, a black cloud of aircraft stretching from horizon to horizon, glinting silver against the twilight. The Blitz had begun. Within minutes, the first bombs fell across London docks, Stepney, and the East End. The explosions rolled across the river like thunder, breaking glass for miles. Gas mains ignited. Roofs collapsed. The sky turned orange, then red. Families scrambled from their homes, clutching children and blankets. For many, it was the first time they ran toward those silly shelters, half buried in their own back gardens. They could hear the whistle of bombs before impact, the ground shaking beneath their knees. In that moment, laughter turned to prayer. The shelters that once seemed ridiculous suddenly felt like salvation. Above, the Luftwaffe's crews could see the city burning, the docks, the warehouses, the long stretches of terraced homes. From their cockpits, some felt triumph. Others, quiet unease. The war had finally reached the heart of London. And the British people, ordinary, stubborn, unyielding, would now be tested in ways no one had imagined. London, the 7th of September 1940. The clock had just passed 5 p.m. when the air raid sirens began their mournful wail. At first, people thought it was another false alarm. Many had already grown numb to the sound, that rising, falling moan that had haunted the city for months without consequence. But this time, the sound didn't stop. From the south, over the Thames estuary, came the first wave 348 bombers, escorted by 617 fighters. Their formation filled the evening sky like a dark ceiling. Witnesses on rooftops recalled the sunlight glinting off hundreds of silver wings as the planes banked toward the city. The hum became a growl, and then a roar. In the East End, the docks were the first to burn. Oil tanks erupted in towering flames that painted the river crimson. Warehouses filled with timber and rubber ignited like kindling, sending columns of black smoke thousands of feet high. Barges drifted loose, burning as they went, while sailors dove into the black water below. From Barking to Rotherhithe, it felt like the earth itself was cracking open. Inside one small terraced house on Southwark Park Road, a young mother named Margaret Williams grabbed her two children by the hands. Her husband, already in uniform, had been called to the auxiliary fire service. The family had laughed about their Anderson shelter weeks before, calling it their buried bathtub. Now she dragged her children toward it in the garden, the roar of engines above nearly deafening. They tripped over the muddy entrance, clutching a candle, their gas masks, and a single photograph. As the bombs fell, soil showered the steel roof like rain. Then came a blast so strong it blew out the candle and filled the air with dust. The little boy began to cry. Margaret pulled him close, whispering, "It's all right, love. We're safe down here." When she finally emerged hours later, the street was gone. The row of houses she'd known since childhood was flattened, a landscape of brick, smoke, and silence. The shelters that had been mocked, ignored, or used as chicken coops were now the only things standing. By midnight, fires raged across Wapping, Millwall, and Stepney. The sky glowed orange, and the air was thick with soot. Firefighters worked until they collapsed, their hoses melting from the heat. At the London docks, the fire brigade fought to protect the river's edge, while bombs fell around them in perfect intervals every 10 seconds. Another impact. One officer later said it sounded like the slow beating of a monstrous drum. The Royal Air Force tried to intercept the waves, but the bombers came too fast, too many. Hurricanes and Spitfires clawed at the sky, downing what they could, but the city still burned beneath them. In the early hours, Prime Minister Winston Churchill stood on a rooftop near the Thames, watching the flames rise from the docks. "This," he said quietly to his aide, "is the war we have been waiting for." He didn't mean it in triumph, but in inevitability. Britain had been bracing for this. Now it was here. As dawn broke, smoke hung like fog across London. The streets were unrecognizable, jagged piles of brick, glass, and splintered beams. Whole neighborhoods vanished overnight. Over 400 civilians were dead, thousands injured. And yet, in the middle of the wreckage, something remarkable happened. Shopkeepers opened their doors. Buses resumed their routes. Neighbors shared bread and tea from thermos flasks among the ruins. Photographs taken that morning show women sweeping glass from doorsteps that no longer had walls, children smiling beside cratered gardens, and signs hastily hung, reading, "Business as usual." The defiance was quiet, but real. London had been hit harder than anyone imagined, and still, the city breathed. The German High Command had expected panic. Instead, they found resolve. For the first time, the world saw what would come to be called the Blitz Spirit. It wasn't about courage in the grand sense, not medals or speeches, but the simple refusal to give up. Margaret Williams, like thousands of others, swept the ash from her shelter door that morning, gathered her children, and began again. The shelters were no longer silly. They were lifelines, cold, muddy, cramped, but safe. The raids would come again the next night, and the next. For 57 consecutive nights, the bombers would return. Each evening, the sirens wailed, and each morning, London rose from the smoke. London Autumn 1940. By October, the Blitz had become a grim routine. The sirens began almost every evening, just after sunset, when families were preparing supper or reading by candlelight. At first came the distant rumble, that unmistakable vibration in the air, like a thunderstorm that never moved closer but never went away. Then the city darkened. Street lamps flicked off. Tram lines stopped. The only light left was the cold moon glinting off anti-aircraft guns that lined the parks and rooftops. You could feel the tension settle, an entire metropolis holding its breath. And then the bombs came. Night after night, the Luftwaffe swept in waves, targeting the docks, the railways, and the heart of the capital. The explosions rolled across the city like a drumbeat, shaking windows miles away. For those above ground, it was a storm of fire and noise. For those below, life unfolded in a different world entirely. The underground becomes a city of shadows. At first, the government had forbidden civilians from sheltering in the London Underground. The tunnels were meant for trains, not families. Officials feared panic, disease, and chaos. But as the raids intensified, people ignored the rules. By October, thousands descended into the stations each night, carrying blankets, teapots, and small suitcases. The platforms filled from end to end. Children slept on newspapers. Women brewed tea over makeshift stoves. Someone always had a radio tuned to the BBC. A community was forming underground. At Aldwych Station, an elderly violinist played quiet music to calm the children. At Liverpool Street, nurses tended to the wounded beside families asleep under posters that read, "Keep calm and carry on." Every morning, as the all-clear sounded, they would emerge pale and blinking into the light to find which parts of their city had survived. A city of courage and routine. Above ground, the rhythm of life persisted. Milkmen still made their rounds, stepping over rubble to deliver bottles. Postmen carried letters through cratered streets. Buses, dented and scorched, ran their routes as if defying the sky itself. Even the newspapers, often printed by candlelight, continued to publish headlines. London carries on. Hitler's air arm fails to break British spirit. The message was clear: Britain would not yield. In the East End, where destruction was worst, families shared food and clothing. Neighbors rebuilt each other's shelters, patching holes with old tin and sandbags. When someone's house was hit, others offered a bed, a meal, or simply a cup of tea. The Blitz was brutal, but it united the city in ways peace never had. Children of the blackout. For the young, the war had its own strange rhythm. They played among the ruins by day, collecting shrapnel like treasures. At night, they huddled underground, falling asleep to the distant rumble of anti-aircraft fire. 9-year-old Tommy Gray kept a small notebook, writing down the types of planes he heard each night. 3 Heinkels, he wrote one evening, and one that sounded like a washing machine. His mother laughed when she found it a rare moment of light in the darkness. Yet for every child who laughed, another went missing. Entire streets vanished in single raids. Rescue crews, the ARP wardens, and fire watchers worked tirelessly, pulling survivors from the wreckage, often by hand. They became heroes in flat caps and overalls, the quiet defenders of the home front, the sound that haunted a generation. To those who lived through it, one sound would never be forgotten: the whistle of a falling bomb. It began as a faint hiss, rising in pitch until it ended in silence that split second before impact. Veterans said it froze the blood in your veins. Some people claimed they could tell where a bomb would fall by its sound. Others simply closed their eyes and prayed. When it was over, a strange stillness followed. The dust settled like snow. Then came the cries for names, for family, for help. The next morning, the same people who had wept and coughed in the shelters were sweeping their steps, hanging laundry, reopening shops. The Blitz was turning ordinary men and women into something extraordinary, the spirit that could not be broken. Across the channel, German intelligence watched with disbelief. They had expected chaos, riots, mass flight, the collapse of morale. Instead, they saw a people who refused to bend. One Luftwaffe pilot, captured after being shot down, told his interrogator, "We thought you would be broken in a week. But when we looked down, your city was still glowing, not just from fires, but from lights in the windows." That glow, faint and flickering, was the symbol of something Hitler could never understand: unity born from suffering. As October turned to November, the nights grew colder. Families lined their shelters with old carpets, hung pictures on the curved steel walls, and gave each other small gifts. They were not just surviving anymore, they were enduring. But the worst was yet to come. Because soon, the bombs would not just fall on homes or factories, they would target the heart of Britain's identity itself. London, the 29th of December, 1940. The last Sunday of the year. Cold, silent, brittle with frost. In the darkened city, church bells had long been silenced by order of the government. They would ring only if invasion came. Yet that night, another sound replaced them: the drone of engines. It began just after 6 p.m. From the east, the Luftwaffe's bombers came again, 136. Heinkels and Dorniers, their bellies packed not with high explosives this time, but with incendiaries. Tens of thousands of small magnesium bombs. Their purpose was not to destroy by blast, but by flame. The Second Great Fire of London. Within minutes, the first wave struck the city, the ancient square mile that had stood for centuries. The bombs fell like rain, bursting into blinding white stars that hissed as they struck rooftops. Sparks scattered across streets and gutters. Within an hour, over 1,500 fires burned across the city center. St. Paul's Cathedral, the heart of old London, stood surrounded by a sea of flame. From its dome, fire watchers looked down upon an inferno. The River Thames reflected it all, a mirror of red and gold. The temperature in some areas reached over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Asphalt melted, stone cracked, buildings collapsed from heat alone. The fire engines, already exhausted from weeks of raids, raced from street to street, but many hoses ran dry. The mains had been shattered by earlier blasts. The sky glowed so brightly that pilots flying over France reported seeing the reflection of the flames from 100 miles away. London was burning. The firefighters wore. While the Luftwaffe roared overhead, down in the streets, a different battle raged. The auxiliary fire service, many of them volunteers, often middle-aged men and women, fought through smoke and falling debris to contain the inferno. They wore tin helmets and carried axes, dragging heavy hoses through rubble and glass. One crew near Cheapside formed a human chain to pass buckets when the pumps failed. Another stood silhouetted against a burning skyline, refusing to abandon St. Paul's even as molten lead dripped from its roof. Inside the cathedral, teams of watchmen, some little more than office clerks by day, stamped out incendiaries with sandbags and shovels. At one point, a bomb lodged in the dome's wooden frame, threatening to turn the great church into a torch. Two men climbed up in the choking smoke and dislodged it by hand, throwing it off the edge just before it detonated. When dawn came, St. Paul still stood blackened but unbroken, its dome rising above a city of ashes. Photographer Herbert Mason captured the moment. His image, the dome of St. Paul's shining through smoke and fire, became an instant icon. To the world, it was proof that London's spirit was not extinguished, a city in ruins, but not defeated. The morning after, Londoners walked through streets that no longer existed. Entire districts, Paternoster Row, Watling Street, Guildhall, gone. The air smelled of smoke and damp stone. Snow mixed with ash as firemen still worked the ruins. Yet amid the devastation, there was a strange calm. People greeted each other quietly, offering smiles, thermoses of tea, a spare scarf. Church services were held in basements. Soldiers and civilians cleared debris side by side. In the East End, a boy stood on the edge of a smoking crater, holding a wooden toy Spitfire. "We beat them, didn't we?" he said to a passing warden. The man nodded. It wasn't bravado, it was belief. The Germans had meant to crush morale. Instead, every raid seemed to harden it. Even Hitler, upon hearing that Londoners were still working and the underground was full of laughter, was said to have raged. "They are not human. They are stubborn as rats." But he misunderstood again. It wasn't stubbornness, it was defiance, born of necessity, of love for home, for family, for something larger than fear. The price of endurance. Still, the cost was unimaginable. By the end of that winter, over 20,000 civilians were dead, tens of thousands wounded. 500,000 homes destroyed or rendered uninhabitable. Families lived in shelters for months, their possessions buried under rubble. The nights were long, cold, and uncertain, and yet they sang. Inside the underground tunnels, songs echoed through the darkness. "Roll out the barrel. We'll meet again." Sometimes the music drowned out the bombing for a moment, and people laughed. Not because they weren't afraid, but because fear no longer ruled them. The Blitz was forging a kind of courage that no propaganda could invent, a symbol that could not be silenced. On the night of the 10th of January 1941, Queen Elizabeth, later known as the Queen Mother, visited the East End after another heavy raid. When told her home at Buckingham Palace had also been hit, she replied, "I am glad we have been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." Her words resonated deeply. For the first time, the classes of Britain, rich and poor, city and countryside, shared the same danger, the same darkness. The war had united them more than any policy ever could. As winter turned to spring, London's skyline was still jagged and black. But the Union Jack still flew above it, tattered yet visible through the smoke. The Blitz had failed to break Britain. Instead, it had revealed her soul. But even as the flames faded from London's skies, the war was shifting again from survival to retaliation. The time would soon come when the British people, and the Royal Air Force they had prayed for every night, would take the fight back to Germany itself. Spring 1941 RAF Bomber Command, Lincolnshire. In a dimly lit operations room, the map of Europe stretched across the wall. Strings and pins marked routes from England to the Ruhr, to Berlin, to the docks of Hamburg. The air smelled of tobacco, wet wool, and tension. For months, the Royal Air Force had watched as London burned. The images of shattered streets, of children sleeping underground, of street palls rising through the smoke, all had seared themselves into the hearts of Britain's flyers. Now, the time had come to strike back. We shall give them back their own medicine. Thanks for watching. It began with quiet resolve, not vengeance. The Air Ministry called it strategic bombing. The men simply called it payback. From airfields scattered across eastern England, Scampton, Waddington, Binbrook crews climbed into their bombers. Wellingtons, Whitleys, and the mighty Lancasters soon to come. Engines coughed to life in the darkness, 4 at a time, a sound like the beating of 1,000 hearts. As the aircraft lifted into the night, their pilots looked down at the faint glow of blackout cities below and remembered their families waiting in shelters. The fires reflected in their mothers' eyes. Each mission carried not just bombs, but memory. The turning of the tide. By mid-1941, Bomber Command began its campaign over Germany. The first major raids targeted Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin industrial cities, much like London, filled with workers and families who had once believed the war would never reach them. The results were mixed at first. Navigation was primitive, weather unpredictable, losses heavy. Many crews never returned. But morale in Britain soared with each mission reported. The British press wrote cautiously, never cruelly, but the message was clear. The fire that had consumed London was now crossing the Channel. At night, Londoners gathered at the Thames embankment, watching the distant streaks of light in the sky, their own bombers heading east. Some waved, some prayed. It wasn't celebration, it was justice, weighed in sorrow. The children of the Blitz grow up. For those who had endured the worst, the war had become a teacher. Margaret Williams, the mother who once dragged her children into an Anderson shelter, now worked as a volunteer nurse. Her son Tommy, the boy who once wrote about washing machine bombers, was nearly 12, collecting scrap metal for the war effort. He still kept his little notebook. But now, the sounds he described were the deep rumble of RAF bombers heading for Germany, the same sound that had once terrified him. In his writing, one line stood out. They are flying for us now. That was the essence of Britain's transformation. Fear had turned into purpose. Civilians had become soldiers of endurance. The city that once laughed at silly shelters now produced engines, guns, and planes faster than the enemy could destroy them. A nation tested, a spirit forged. The Blitz ended in May 1941, when Hitler shifted his attention eastward toward Russia. The Luftwaffe withdrew to prepare for a new campaign, leaving behind a scarred but standing Britain. In 9 months, the Germans had dropped over 40,000 tons of bombs on British soil. They had killed over 43,000 civilians and injured more than twice that number. But they had failed to achieve the one thing Hitler demanded most: submission. London still functioned, the buses still ran, Parliament still met, the king still walked the bombed-out streets, and in the hearts of its people, a new kind of faith had taken root, not in leaders or armies, but in one another. The quiet victory. When American journalists visited London in 1941, they were stunned. The city was half ruined, yet somehow more alive than ever. One reporter wrote, "I have seen no city so wounded, and none so unbroken." Another described walking through Covent Garden, where a violinist played softly amid the rubble. Around him, shoppers stepped over debris, buying bread and flowers as if it were any ordinary morning. The war had taken so much, but not the music, not the laughter, not the light that flickered behind every boarded window. This was the true victory of the Blitz, that in trying to destroy Britain's spirit, the enemy had revealed its strength. Epilogue. The legacy of the Anderson shelter. Years later, long after the fires went out, The small, rusting Anderson shelters still dotted English gardens. Some were filled with tools, others converted into chicken coops or garden sheds. But for those who remembered the nights of 1940, they were sacred. Each one told a story of mothers and children huddled in the dark, of neighbors sharing warmth and song, of courage discovered in the unlikeliest of places. They were not silly shelters after all. They were monuments to endurance, to humor, to quiet defiance. And every time the wind passed through their curved steel walls, it carried with it the echo of those who once waited there listening to the bombs and refusing to break. The Blitz did not defeat London, it defined it. The fires that were meant to destroy a city instead illuminated its soul, a light that would never again be extinguished.